Investigation continues into that downed Malaysian airliner blown out of the sky in Ukraine. And let's talk about the U.S. response so far and what might be the response in the near future. Joining us on 710 KURV to talk politics, and we'll try to sneak in some immigration stuff as well, since we know they're talking about legislation up in Washington. Fox News political analyst, Washington Times columnist, Jeff Birnbaum. Welcome back to the show, Jeff. Okay, first on the investigation into that Malaysian airliner. And since all fingers are pointing to pro-Russian separatists, and we're listening to every word that Vladimir Putin has to say and not exactly making the West happy right now, do you suspect any more sanctions against the Soviets, against Russia?
Well, Secretary of State John Kerry on the Sunday talk shows yesterday made very clear that more sanctions were clearly on the table. In fact, all sorts of options are on the table, he said, short of sending soldiers, U.S. soldiers, into the Ukraine. But the problem with more sanctions, and remember, President Obama imposed brand new sanctions just last week, actually the day before the downing of the jetliner. The problem with more sanctions is that we need the Europeans to come up with some sanctions of their own, or we're not going to be making much of a dent in the Russian economy. The real bulk of commerce is with Western Europe, between Western Europe and Russia, and not between Russia and the U.S. So
well, just tell the guys over at the Netherlands to do all the heavy lifting for us. I'm sure that they can convince the Europeans.
Well, it's Germany we need to keep our eye on, and Angela Merkel there. If she comes across with some economic sanctions, then I think the rest of Western Europe will follow.
Joining us on 710 KURV from Fox News is Jeff Birnbaum.
Yeah, Jeff, Tim Sullivan here. I mean, you would think that Europe would start to would be on board with additional sanctions because of the high number of Dutch victims from that downed plane. If the Netherlands can, persuade Germany to do more.
I think so. There are two problems, two obstacles. One is that Western Europe cannot impose painful things on Russia without hurting itself.
Yeah.
So large is the commerce. In addition, it's hard to see a scenario where we will know with absolute certainty that Russia was behind the downing of the aircraft. So there's enormous circumstantial evidence that the missiles have been moved, and we don't know who, if you will, pushed the button. We may never know those things, and those might either slow or actually stop the process of sanctions.
Has Putin made the appropriate statements? Has Putin's response been adequate to this tragedy?
Well, it's actually overnight he said things that would have made sense for him to say 4 days ago when all of this originally happened. That is, calling on the separatists to cooperate with international investigators and that sort of thing. Saying it now is way too late and meaningless, as have been most of the assurances that Russia has given the West on anything to do with Ukraine. So I think it's only fair to be dubious about how much we should believe what Putin said.
Hey, Jeff, before we continue this conversation on that airliner, can we press you a little bit, to squeeze you a little bit on what you're hearing on the immigration legislation up in D.C.?
Of course, Bill. There's no question but that there is bipartisan support for sending money down to McAllen and other places that are facing this huge number of children who need housing and the proper process in front of court. The question is, can the immigration issue, which is so contentious here, be laid aside in broad terms in order to get that money where it belongs? There are bipartisan talks now going on, but there's not agreement as best I can.
And it's not going to happen before the August recess, obviously.
In all likelihood,
okay.
not.
Are you talking about the money from the $3.7 billion that the president has asked Congress to approve? Is that the funding?
That's right. Some portion of that.
Yeah.
Any indication of how Congress is viewing the Cornyn-Cuellar so-called Humane Act.
Which I think is linked to that funding too, Tim. So if that fails, the other one is not going to move forward either.
That's right. But the talks like that are, I think, gaining momentum. I'm afraid to say that, and this is a horrible thing to say about Washington, but I think people understand it, that because it appears that there's been some reduction in the number of children coming across the border, the urgency with which lawmakers had been taking this effort might diminish somewhat this week, unless pressure is put on them to do otherwise.
10-4. And why are you so concerned about saying something bad about D.C.? They never say anything good about you anyway.
Yeah, don't be afraid, Jeff, to criticize Washington. I mean, go for it.
It's the thing to do.
I'm feeling very gentle this week.
All right, Jeff, thank you much. Jeff Birnbaum from Fox News joining us on 710 KURV.